Hi everyone, this is Danny, and in this lecture today we're going to be going through my quick overview of the persuasive devices that you're going to be needing to know and be able to identify in your upcoming SAC. So while you're listening to this lecture, you're going to need to be doing a couple of things. You might be the type of person that prefers to listen to the entire lecture and then at the end you write down notes, or you might be a person that likes to pause as you go through each of the slides so that you can get down all of the information. You need to work out what's going to be best for you, but what I would recommend is that as you're going, pause, write down the important points that you need, and make sure that you're compiling notes as you go. You need to have something physical after this. When you're listening, if you have any questions or you're confused about anything, feel free to email me or Facebook me or speak to me in class. I'll be more than happy to go through any questions that you might have. So let's get started. There's a couple of terms that are going to come up during this area of study that you need to be familiar with. So let's go through them. So first of all, contention. A contention is basically the point of view or the main line of argument that a particular person is making. So a contention is usually going to be a very short statement that sums up the entire argument that a person is making. Next, there's a media type. A media type is what type of piece you are being presented with. So it might be speech, it might be a letter to the editor, it might be an editorial. So for your SAC and throughout this area of study, you can be given any type of media piece, and it's important that you learn how to identify them because you're going to need to be able to do that in your introduction. Next, persuasive devices. That's basically a blanket term that is used to describe the persuasive techniques that writers and speakers use in their arguments to persuade or position their readers or their audiences. So it's basically the techniques that people employ to prove that their arguments are right. Positioning, when you hear that word, basically that is trying to explain how people are influenced by persuasive devices or by facts and statistics. So it's how we're actually being convinced that an argument is right, or how we're supposed to be convinced that an argument is right. So it's basically the technique at work. So effect. Effect basically is the way that we describe how persuasive devices are meant to position the reader or the audience into responding in a particular way. So effect might be a reader feels frustrated or bitter or unhappy or something like that. So it's basically the impact that a persuasive device is meant to have on the reader or the audience. So audience or reader, sometimes students can get a bit confused with this. So an audience is basically people who are listening to a speech. So you would only really refer to audience in terms of someone listening to a speech. A reader is what you use to describe the people that would read this newspaper or they would read this letter to the editor. So audience and reader are how you would describe the effect on people. Headline. A headline is basically the big type font on a newspaper article. A headline can often sum up the contention of the piece. Visuals. Visuals refers to the images or the cartoons that have been put in with the piece that you're analysing. The visuals are just as important as the written language in analysing how persuasive language is being used. So a visual is also another type of persuasive device. Publication basically refers to where a piece may have been published, such as the Herald Sun or the Age or Women's Day or something like that. So it's really important that you guys come to learn all of these glossary words because they're words that you're going to be using in your essays, and also just so you can have a strong idea of what we're discussing in class. Next, different media types. So media types are the type of writing or the type of pieces that you can be given in a SAC or an exam. So there's a few different types. The first one, editorial. An editorial can be recognised because usually it's not going to have an individual author's name assigned to it like an opinion piece does. An editorial usually is an article that expresses an editor's opinion on a topical issue. An editorial can also be a group of editors at a newspaper like the Herald Sun that come together and they write an editorial that's meant to express the point of view of the paper as a whole. So not so much about individual like an opinion piece is. A letter to the editor, they're usually really easy to recognise because it will have the person's name at the bottom, so it might say something like Joe Smith Reservoir. So usually it's going to be written in a letter format. It's usually going to be one of the shortest media pieces that you'll see, and they're written in response to something that's probably been published in a newspaper earlier, so they're usually written in response to something. Next is speech. A speech is basically something that is meant to be presented aloud. So sometimes in SACs or exams you might get a typed version of a speech, but you can tell that it's a speech because of the way that it's written and also because it usually addresses an audience specifically. So it might say something like, "My fellow Australians" or "My fellow Americans" or something like that. Speeches are probably one of the rarest media types to get. You don't see them come up in SACs or exams very often, but it's important that you're aware of them. Next, opinion piece. An opinion piece is an article where a writer expresses their personal opinion. So that's someone like an Andrew Bolt or someone like that who's employed by a paper to give their opinion on a particular issue. Usually they're controversial or provocative, but usually it's a piece that's written by an individual person and it represents their contention on a particular issue. Next, the blog post, you're usually going to recognise those because they can be written sort of in an opinion piece style, like it might be a blog post written by a particular journalist, but a blog post is usually going to have a website attached to it. So if you're given a piece that reads like an opinion piece, but it says that it was published on essentialbaby.com or something like that, you'll usually be able to see that it is a blog post. The last one, comments, that usually comes along with a blog post. Comments are basically those little mini comments that people can post on websites or on online newspapers where they're responding to an issue. So I guess a comment is often like an updated version of the letter to the editor. A tone. This can be something that students can find a little bit confusing, but a tone basically refers to either the voice of the writer or the writer's attitude to both the subject and the reader. So tones are usually described with words that you might use when you're trying to depict a voice. So you could have like an angry tone, a sympathetic tone, a calm tone, a reasonable tone. And tone can sometimes be a little bit difficult for students to pick up on. So maybe the best way of going about that is, if you possibly can, you could try reading a piece aloud. That's a really good way of testing tone. Or you can just try to do your best as you read it to pick up on the tone. And like another good tip is that tone often changes throughout a piece. Like you're not going to have a piece that's just going to be in the one tone, especially if it's an editorial or a blog post or something like that. Tone changes like our voice does. Emotive language. Emotive language is something that's probably going to pop up on any type of media piece that you would get for a SAC or for an exam. It's just something that people use a lot of the time. So this is a really important one to learn and to know. So emotive language, the best way to sort of think about that is to think about it as being emotional language. So it's language that's supposed to provoke a particular response in a reader and audience. So it's colourful words or descriptive language. So like instead of saying something like hot, you might use blistering or muggy or suffocating or something like that. So it's basically using words to provoke an emotional response in the reader.